Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to begin. Please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. We would like to remind you that food and drink are not permitted in the theater. Also, please note that photography and audio and video recording is prohibited. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to see all of you. My name is Rachel Dry. I'm your host tonight. When they told us like about 6 weeks ago maybe that we could do a show on March 4th, I said, that is great. That'll be right after Super Tuesday. And even like the end of last week, I thought it's gonna be so great to have this conversation with everyone the day after Super Tuesday. And then when I was leaving this building at 3 a.m. this morning, and I remembered they didn't have professional makeup coming before this, I thought I should consider the calendar more fully next time. But it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. We're gonna have a wonderful series of conversations about this somewhat disorienting, fascinating political moment we're in. Luckily, all of the news just happened, so there's no news really that can continue to happen. We can talk about it all tonight. They got it all in under the wire for us. I'll tell you a little bit about me, as we're going to be spending the evening together here. I'm one of the deputy politics editors. I've been doing politics editing for about 8 months now, and it's been great, actually personally, because I'm my mother's favorite Rachel again. She really loves MSNBC. This political season has coincided with her increased fluency with texting. So I get a lot of story ideas, and then all caps, this is not from MSNBC, this is me. A lot of the questions are, what are the Russians doing? People should really listen to me. And then she's branched out into emojis. So right before New Hampshire, I just got flamenco dancer, prayer hands, Amy Klobuchar. Which is actually quite astute political analysis if you think about it for that moment. I'm from Vermont originally, like Bernie Sanders. Actually, both Bernie Sanders and I are Jews from Vermont. There aren't a lot of us. When I was growing up, I thought Rachel was an unusual name. I tried to tell that joke in Des Moines, and it did not work. Thank you, New York City. Afterwards, the host of the event, he said, you should know there aren't a lot of Jews in Des Moines. And I was like, yeah, no, I got it. Thank you. Vermont is a very small state, and it sometimes seems like everyone has a Bernie Sanders story. My Bernie Sanders story is that when I was a junior high clarinetist, which is something every woman wants to say on stage to a large group of people, he and I together were in the same Memorial Day parades. I was wearing like a maroon situation, doing clarinet-based choreography, and he was exactly the same, because Bernie Sanders has been exactly the same for quite some time. I'd like to think I've changed. Speaking of change, we are experiencing a great deal of change in this political cycle, this political story, and that's what we're going to spend an evening talking about. I have one guest first. I'm going to have a one-on-one conversation. We're going to show you a little bit of video from the trail, and then I'm going to have a broader conversation with a panel of some of my colleagues in the politics team here. And while we're talking, or even before we start talking, you can submit questions, because we will be answering your questions. We want to hear what's on your mind, what you want to know from New York Times political reporters. There it is on the screen behind me. And we'd love to hear from you. So anytime in the evening, before we turn to questions, please submit yours. Next up, I'm extremely thrilled to invite a very special guest to the stage. This was a tough booking, but tonight, the day after Super Tuesday, I would like to introduce you now to the New York Times Needle. Now, we thought it might be a somewhat limited conversation if I just invited the Needle. So I'm also very pleased to introduce the Needle's representative, Amanda Cox, the editor of The Upshot, the New York Times. Amanda, please. Hi. So Amanda is in charge of the team that puts this all together, and I don't want to make assumptions, but I assume some of us were fixated on this last night. This is the Super Tuesday Needle situation. And I wanted to start by asking, when someone's looking at all of these needles, what do you most hope they understand about it?
Yeah, I mean, we really think of the Needle as kind of like hanging out with a friend on election night who knows a ton about political geography. Like, I'm serious about that.
Yeah, like your friend.
Sometimes your friend
poking you all the time.
Sometimes your friend will tell you some hard truth, and sometimes your friend will tell you, things that you didn't know. And so we really think watching raw election results can be really misleading just because of the way some types of states report their votes. And so if you're going to do it, you should have the best capabilities you can to say, like, what does this mean? And that's, we think the Needle is a sign of some early takeaways, like last night. By 8 o'clock, we were pretty sure that Biden was going to have a really good night, both in states won and delegate totals. So we think it's like an early sign of some of the big takeaways of what an election night means.
So this one that we captured is before we knew any results. And I wondered if you could tell us what has gone into those numbers, where the Needle is before we actually know how anyone decided. What are we looking at?
Yeah, so the way the Needle works is it starts with some expectations about how a place might vote. So that could be polls, it can be census data, it can be like, there's a lot of college kids that live here, or a lot of Latino voters. We know sometimes in some states how many people have returned an absentee ballot, which was important last night, like early voters and day of voters were super different. In some states we know precisely who has returned that ballot. And then we also know a lot about the rules. Like last night, the day before the election, Pete and Amy filed the paperwork so their votes wouldn't count in Colorado. So we need to know, like, if you're going to compute delegate math in Colorado, those are going to be 0 for sure. Or you may remember there's a gerrymandering case in North Carolina where they had to redraw the congressional district boundaries, which is how most delegates are awarded. So, and knows stuff about the rules. Like, the day before Super Tuesday, we were like, did we take care of North Carolina? Like,
You did. You took it.
We took care of North Carolina. So it's really, it starts with expectations about how a place is going to vote, merges those with the results as we have them, and then just updates those expectations. So last night early on, Biden's doing better than these original expectations. We should maybe, shift everywhere a little bit better for Biden, or at least demographically similar places better for Biden.
So can you walk us through, so your team works on the second floor, the politics teams works on the third floor, and so my experience with the Needle is just looking at it, refreshing compulsively. That's a relatable experience to anybody. So what's happening between the hours of, say, 9 p.m. and, I don't know, 5 a.m. is when you said you left this morning.
Sure.
As we're switching from we think this is going to happen to this has happened, what's going into the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's taking the flow of results data, which comes from, stringers across the country, or in some cases, states report the totals for a place. And they, so we start with our pre-expectations, which are based on polls and demographic stuff. We have the results that come in. And, we also have some expectations about how likely counties are to be what we call liars about whether they're done or not. Like percent reporting means a lot of...
How does a county lie?
So it's not technically lying, but we think of like something like California. California right now, if you don't know how to interpret 100% reporting in California, you will not know that half of the vote there still has to be counted, right? Like, because there's complicated
so it's like sending
things.
a text, I'm 5 minutes away when you haven't left your apartment.
Or it's like, I'll do the thing, and I've done half the thing, but that's enough, kind of, right? So, there's early mail
That's not
mail
reassuring
vote.
in terms of election results, but like as a broader karmic. Like
No, it's just it's how you interpret things like percent reporting. So we get some results. Like, so for last night, for example, we get the first states close. Biden does better than we were expecting in Virginia. We were expecting him to do well. He does even better. He does even better in a couple more states. By 9 o'clock, or 8 o'clock, Texas starts to close its polls. And the first votes there are good for Bernie. We don't trust them because we know they're all early vote. And so we say, you know what? I just don't trust these things yet because no county is completed. And so at that point, some of our bosses are downstairs like, why do you think Biden is still doing so well in Texas? And the answer, what the needle is doing is saying, I don't trust these results yet, either because I know they come from an unrepresentative set of places, right? We know urban and rural places just vote differently in America, right? And so if the first results don't come from a set of places that makes, is representative, they're not going to be meaningful in a way that people try to interpret them.
So was there one number or moment that was most surprising to you last night?
I think my colleague Nate Cohen, who is behind some of the, the data and the thinking and the knowledge of political geography that goes behind this, tweeted this afternoon the difference between the results, our initial expectations and the results where they stand right now. Not everyone's done counting, but those results. And I think the biggest one was Biden doing better in Virginia than we thought, which maybe, in technical sense, I think that you would have to call the most surprising. You can explain it to yourself easily. Maybe that's not the most surprising, but that is a gap, or, that is the place where our expectations, and we know now that the early day vote and the day of had just huge gaps, and so.
You published a story before Iowa about reintroducing the needle to readers, and you said, can the needle be wrong? This was a question you were going to answer, and no offense to the needle. And you said, depends on what you mean by wrong, which is also what I like to say when someone asks me if I'm wrong. I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, especially as, going forward through November, a lot of us are going to be thinking about how to interpret predictions. So depends on what you mean by wrong.
Yeah, so let me get an example on that screen. When we say, maybe Sanders in Massachusetts, and we have the needle at like 50%, a little over 50%. You can see the needle edges like a little bit past the straight vertical line. That is not, Biden wins Massachusetts. That is not something we think of as wrong, right? And we know that people struggle to interpret probability, right? Like, we're really serious about probability. When we say someone has like a 70% chance of winning, we're really serious that we should be, in some people's view, wrong 30% of the time, right? Like, that is how probability works. Like, 70% means 70%. It doesn't mean like 70 is greater than 50, so I round it to 100 and that's a race call, right? Like, and we know people struggle with this mentally, and we've tried to do some work with these words, these characterizations you see. Like, there's empirical things about what people think about words. Like, for some of you, if I said, what does the word unlikely mean? Some of you would say 0%, and some of you would say 40%. And we know that, and we've tried to pick words this year that have a narrower.
What does unlikely mean to you?
We are using, we would not use that word because it has too far of a range, right?
Okay.
Like, we know that people cannot interpret unlikely if we're talking to a broad set of people. So that's one way it can be wrong. And we don't think of that as wrong ourselves. If we miss a 70% race, if we have 10 70% races, we actually think we should miss 3 of them. That way, statisticians call that calibrated. Like, that's the right number of misses if we're actually saying 70%. We don't think of that as wrong. We know some of the world does, and we know that is a fight that we will never win. But there are other ways, deeper ways that it can be wrong, right? Like, the needle is essentially anticipating the vote that hasn't been counted yet. You can do a pretty good job of anticipating that vote based on demographics, how places tend to vote. But sometimes they're just surprises, And so if you think of the very last votes to be reported just being a huge surprise for whatever reason, who knows why?
Yeah.
And if we fail to anticipate that, in that sense, I think is a real
I'm
way of
interested
wrong.
in that you're talking about how words shape how people feel about numbers. And I wondered if we could pull back a little and talk about polls more generally and what people are looking for and hoping for when they're looking at numbers on a screen, for reassurance that the person they want to win is going to win, for holding out hope, even when it looks unlikely, whatever their personal definition of unlikely is. How do you think about like the spiritual, emotional part of the needle and the numbers that you're delivering to people?
Yeah, I mean, we really do not feel like people have to watch live results on election night, right? Like, I really believe that there are like a billion more long-lasting ways you could spend your night. But at the same time, like, we know
just like pull up the New York Times in the background and then go meditate, but just keep it up on your screen.
You know, we know that millions of people do, right? We know that there is demand, and the needle is really about, if you're gonna do it, we think you deserve to do it with context. You know, like, we respect you enough to want to tell you everything we know about the results embedded in this number. You know, and I know, you know, we think in some part the emotional reaction that the needle evokes in people, in some ways, is a measure of success, right? There have been election nights where the same information was clear in a table and a map, and people had, you know, didn't understand it because they didn't understand enough about the political geography to know what it meant. And so I actually think sometimes, you know, on some nights when people's candidates lose, and they either love or hate the needle, right? That is in some sign, a sign of like some form of success about like, I understood what those numbers meant, because that's the goal of the needle, is to tell you what they mean the whole way through in like as little of a misleading way as possible.
It's extremely reassuring. You're just very unlikely to ever be wrong by whatever definition you're going to use. So I just have one last quick question. What is going to happen?
We're gonna need a lot more needles.
Amanda, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Amanda Cox of the Upchat. Thank you. So we're gonna have a panel discussion very shortly, but before that, we just wanted to catch you up on what happened yesterday. So there's a little bit of a video presentation that our video colleagues put together on Super Tuesday, and we'll be back with some more colleagues momentarily. Thank you.
Super Tuesday is the single most important date on the primary calendar. You have more than a dozen states and territories voting at the same time. And it is the first real test of which candidates are drawing broad national appeal.
Winston-Salem, thank you!
Hello, Denver!
Tennessee will deliver. This is the volunteer state.
The biggest prizes on the map are Texas and California. But all told, you're looking at about a third of all the delegates that are at stake in the Democratic primary are at stake on Super Tuesday. This was a good night, especially for Joe Biden.
It's a good night! It's a good night!
We have seen that Biden has been regaining traction in the race over the last couple days.
It ain't over, man. We're just getting started.
But he pulled off a series of big wins and upsets in places where even a newly revived Biden campaign wasn't terribly optimistic about winning. Over the last few days, we have seen an extraordinary coalescing of support around Joe Biden.
I am ending my campaign and endorsing Joe Biden.
When he collected those endorsements on Monday from Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, that only accelerated his new momentum. So many of Joe Biden's most important and biggest victories on Super Tuesday came in states where black voters make up either a majority or a very, very large share of the primary electorate.
We just got in from Alabama. We've won Alabama.
Joe Biden edged out a narrow victory in Texas, but it was a close outcome, and Bernie Sanders recorded very significant support, especially from Latino voters and progressives. This was a solid night for Bernie Sanders. This was not some massive setback. It was not the massive breakthrough that his campaign hoped it would be. But what we did see him do was continue adding significantly to his delegate count in a series of states where his progressive base was strong.
Hi, my name's Tom. I'm from the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign.
Most importantly, California. In his speech on election night,
This will become a contrast in ideas.
Bernie Sanders made it pretty clear that in the coming weeks he is going to be going after Joe Biden even more aggressively.
One of us in this race led the opposition to the war in Iraq. You're looking at him.
It was not such a good night for Michael Bloomberg and Elizabeth Warren. Warren has needed to make a comeback, and she did not carry a single state. She even came in third in her home state of Massachusetts. This was the first time that Michael Bloomberg's name appeared on a ballot in this Democratic primary. He spent hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising and other campaign operations in the Super Tuesday states. In the end, he only won a single contest in American Samoa. Ultimately, Bloomberg dropped out.
What does it all mean? We have the live action version of the video right here. Let me introduce you to my very generous and sleep-deprived, but in it nonetheless brilliant New York Times political colleagues. So Astead Herndon, Maggie Haberman, Alex Burns, and Lisa Lerer. And we're going to tell you what this all means to the best of our ability. And again, if you have questions for the panel, some things we're discussing as we're going along, you can send those to the address that I think they'll put back up on the screen in a minute. So there was a little news in the last 24, 72 hours. There's been some news. There are only 6 candidates. There were 6 total candidates. There were 28 at the highest, I think. I think that's right. You can check it later. Bloomberg is out of the race, obviously. But the biggest news, of course, as we saw in the video, is the day that Joe Biden had yesterday, his dominant Super Tuesday. I think at a somewhat dark moment in the evening last night, I was looking up triumph in the thesaurus, which felt like the opposite of a triumph. That's where I needed to be. But I wanted to start a study. You spent the week before the South Carolina primary doing reporting there, and Biden's results in South Carolina had a huge impact on what happened for him yesterday. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like a moment or person you met during the week, something you saw in terms of how people were thinking about the former vice president, thinking about how they were going to vote, that might explain kind of where we are now.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we learned was just the importance of South Carolina, and if you are going to be a Democrat who is running on kind of a moderate platform, or it starts with black voters, just mathematically for Democratic Party, and that was obviously the first test of who had strength there. Now, we've known for a year that Joe Biden was the leader among black voters. That was what polling was telling us. But after New Hampshire, we were seeing a sort of tightening that was happening in the state that really did cause some panic. It's not as if that it was always a set thing that Joe Biden was going to win South Carolina by the big margins that he did. There was real sense after New Hampshire that, oh my, like this might be closer than we all thought, in a way that did not give him the type of electoral firewall. But I remember, so I left Nevada before the caucuses and went to South Carolina, and with that kind of premise, that it was tightening, we knew the polling was telling us it was tightening, Tom Steyer was taking some of those voters. But in that last week, you could just really feel things breaking Joe Biden's way. You saw him perform decently well in Nevada. But most importantly, he had a good debate. He got an endorsement from Jim Clyburn. And you would also just got a sense from voters that the real reality of are we going to nominate Bernie Sanders was setting in. And for those voters, that was a negotiation and a trust level that they did not have with that candidate.
So you did this really interesting piece on the Black church in South Carolina and its role in terms of how politicians try and reach voters. And I just wondered, in some of that reporting, when you walked in and said, what do you think of Joe Biden, what kind of reactions did you get?
Oh, it's universally positive. It starts, kind of the first name association is as Barack Obama's vice president. That's not just a reflexive thing. That is a sense of pride for black voters, that this president, who was historic, and is kind of universally loved, that he stood with him in the toughest moments, that he helped deliver him the presidency in 2008, and that is what drives that sense of connection. But there is also just a sense of trust that I think you can't underestimate when it comes to black voters. The known quantity versus the unknown. I mean, when you think about black voters throughout the South, unknown quantities of politicians have rarely worked out for them, especially unknown quantities of white politicians promising big changes. Promising kind of government expansion. That's kind of rarely worked in their favor. And so you had a real sense of pragmatism, but you also just had a real sense of rallying around the person who had been there for them and their telling in kind of the tougher moments.
Lisa, I wanted to ask, I remember in New Hampshire, maybe 4 or 5 days before, no, it was the weekend before the primary, you went to a Biden event trying to talk to New Hampshire voters, seeing what was on their mind, and you met a lot of people from Long Island.
I did meet a number of people from Long Island, as well as from New Jersey and Massachusetts and California and Rhode Island. So what was striking about the event was it was Sunday before the New Hampshire primary, and it was packed with political tourists, which is a common phenomenon in Iowa and New Hampshire. But normally you do see some actual voters also at the event. So that was certainly a harbinger of how Biden was going to do in that state. But I think what people told me when I spoke to them there, and what people have told all of us throughout this whole campaign, is that Democrats just want to find someone who can beat Donald Trump. Now that may be really an unknowable thing in many ways, but I think at that moment in New Hampshire, Biden had lost Iowa, he was not doing well in New Hampshire. He did not look like someone who could beat Donald Trump. But in a race where everyone's obsessed with electability, it turns out winning can really do a lot for you. Winning makes you look like someone who can win things. So when he won South Carolina, that helped him a lot. And then when he had these other sort of more moderate candidates point to him as the guy to go with, I think that helped him, and that allowed him to kind of be the person that was going to be the opponent to Bernie Sanders. And I think that's what, when I talked to those voters who said they were not very enthusiastic about Joe Biden, they just wanted to check out the scene in New Hampshire, that's what they were looking for.
They wanted to see, what is this guy? I'm not sure about him, right?
One of them told me they wanted to do an energy check, and the energy, they said, was low. But I don't know, I should call him back, because now, he may, after South Carolina, after that endorsement rally, Joe Biden has been a little bit more, what we've seen of him on the stump has been perhaps more energetic. He might have a different view, because we certainly saw that in the Super Tuesday states.
Joe-mentum is high.
That's the phrase, yes. That's the phrase.
Sorry, I meant to start with this. I apologize. I just want to go down the line here. What's one sort of Biden-related data point from the last 24 hours that was the most surprising to you when you saw it? Like a state he won, the margin he carried it by, the number of times he said, "God love you," into the microphone, like anything Biden-related. I'll start with Maggie, because whatever we got.
I don't think there was a single state. I mean, I just think the breadth of the win, and certainly the margins by which he won in certain places. I can't think of another time where there's been a similar political comeback. And I think it speaks to a confluence of a lot of factors that we haven't seen before. I think it speaks to the fact that everything was stacked so close together. That Super Tuesday came right after South Carolina. I think it spoke to how unsettled the race was, and the fact that you saw this massive shift away from Mike Bloomberg, who people were looking interested in, toward Joe Biden for all of the reasons that Astead and Lerer were talking about electability and about feeling comfortable with somebody. But it's just the volume. I mean, that's what strikes me.
The volume. Yeah. Alex, what about you?
I think two things. First, just the victory margins in Virginia and North Carolina, right? Those are two states that I think we expected going in that Biden was going to do well and probably win them. I don't think that we expected that he would win Virginia by the same margin he won South Carolina.
So this is not a pop quiz. I'm only asking because I'm pretty sure you know. Can you just remind us what those margins were?
So the last time I checked, which may have been with like 95% reporting,
okay.
So don't hold me to this, it was about 30 points in Virginia and 15 points in North Carolina. Those are massive margins in a two-person race, and this was not a two-person race in these states. And especially when you think about where Biden had been in those places a week or two before. We didn't have a ton of public polling in these states, but the polling we had suggested that it was pretty close to a three-way tie in both of those states between Biden and Sanders and Mike Bloomberg. And so that's just an enormous amount of movement in a really short period of time. And compounding that is how high the turnout was in both of those states and across the country. That the whole Bernie Sanders theory of this primary and ultimately the general election was when you generate higher voter turnout, that means that irregular voters, low propensity voters, a lot of young people will show up and they will vote for me, Bernie Sanders, the candidate promising revolutionary change. There was a massive surge in turnout in a lot of these places. Virginia was just staggering, and it clearly worked to a different candidate's benefit.
Astead, what would you say was most surprising Joe Biden data point?
Yeah, I'll pick two. I would say him winning Massachusetts, which to me signaled the kind of consolidation. I mean, there was a thought, as someone who has spent a lot of time with Elizabeth Warren's campaign, that the ending of Klobuchar and Buttigieg would have some things flow to her, because that was an overlap of kind of college, white-educated liberals who in Iowa and New Hampshire were choosing kind of between those three candidates. I think what the Massachusetts results showed us was that by this point, where they were flowing had completely changed. They weren't going to kind of Warren as the kind of other pseudo-smart candidate from Buttigieg. They were going to more ideologically. That was not meant to be an insult. I was just.
No.
My bad.
Some states lie, Amanda told us. Pseudo-smart is a political designation.
Yeah, I'm just saying
that's why you come to these live events, you get this information.
The candidate that presents kind of smartness. But I don't know if that made it better or worse. But
it's fine. It's being recorded. It's
yeah. But I'm out. But they went to Biden is the end of the story. And then the other point I would say is that Biden was running even with Sanders among younger black people. And that was supposed to be the group that gave Sanders enough of black vote to kind of keep the margins low. And if Joe Biden's running even with you among younger black voters, he's gonna whoop you in older ones. And so that was a bad sign.
Lisa?
So I think the number that stood out to me is 36. And this is kind of a little bit of a point off Alex's point, which is that's the highest amount of the vote share Bernie Sanders got in any state. So, we had a lot of questions about whether what his ceiling was. The idea was that for a long time that Bernie Sanders had a strong core of support, like a high floor, but a low ceiling. And this really gave us our first sort of taste of what that ceiling might be. And in a two-person race, 36 isn't going to get you there. And I think that is a reflection of a lot of the dynamics that Alex was talking about, right? That the people who Bernie Sanders had been promising would power his win and expand the electorate, which is the way he's been saying for weeks, months, that he would beat Donald Trump, they didn't show up in the numbers they expected. Young voters, Latinos, young voters in a lot of these states, their share of the electorate went down a little bit. Latinos were fairly constant. And who did tick up in a lot of these places were black voters and like college-educated women, a group that sometimes political strategists call the resistance moms. And those are the groups that really powered a lot of the Democrats' win in these like suburban congressional districts in 2018. So, some of this may be a good, like the Democratic strategists see this as a good harbinger for the general election potentially, that the enthusiasm is still there, but it's probably not a great sign for Bernie Sanders.
So we've been talking about a man who had a good day yesterday. So I'm going to shift gears to a man who had not a great day yesterday and who ended his run this morning. So Michael Bloomberg. And so he won't be competing, won't be campaigning in New York in advance of the New York primary. So Maggie, I know you covered him as a mayor and covered some of his mayoral races. I just wondered if you could give us a little taste, so we won't see it up close and personal here, of what Michael Bloomberg is like on the campaign trail.
They're
a natural. Yeah.
I'm just searching for the words. Mike Bloomberg is not known for his interpersonal skills with people who don't work for him or don't socialize with him. When he was running for mayor the first time in 2001, he did very limited voter contact. When he did do it, it sometimes ended in saying things like asking voters in Brooklyn which sports team they liked, and when they said the Jets, he'd say, I know the owner.
That's relatable, you know.
It's a true thing that happened. You can probably find it on YouTube. And he did in this campaign, I think, pretty limited direct voter contact and maximized paid media, which is also what he did in his first campaign, and then certainly in the ones that followed, although by then he was mayor. But there was one bit that he had that I know was very amusing to our colleague, Matt Flegenheimer, and we wrote about it in a story we did about his 2001 race, where Bloomberg always liked to high five with a kid, and then he'd pull his hand away, and leaving the kid kind of swatting at the wind. So,
you know, retail politics.
Right. So that was not his skill, but I mean, but to be fair, just not to conclude it on a note where we're kicking someone when they're down. I think that Bloomberg actually did have a lot of compelling reasons why he wanted to run. I think that he did have compelling aspects of his record. He also had very controversial aspects of his record for this moment in the Democratic Party. And then there's his main reason for why he could beat Trump was all of his money. And that is not a beloved factor for Democratic primary voters right now. So.
I'm interested that we're calling him down, so it's fair. Well,
I mean, you described him as having a pretty bad day yesterday.
Yeah, no, it's true, it's fair. No, he's bad. So he's no longer in the race. I wondered what impact he still had. Alex, where do you think we are in a world where Michael Bloomberg never got in?
Gosh, it's a great question. There was a period of time where there was a totally realistic possibility that he would end up as the Democratic nominee and the president. If you take away that Nevada debate, if he just skips the debates altogether, or if he goes in and has like a slightly less awful answer on NDAs, right? Or if Joe Biden wins South Carolina by 10 points instead of by 30 points. I don't know where we are right now, right? Because there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who, Maggie's of course totally right, that the idea of electing one of the wealthiest people on the planet to be the president is uncomfortable for a lot of Democrats. There are also a lot of Democrats who are very, very drawn to the idea that this guy can just spend whatever it takes to win, right? That there was one columnist who wrote that winning the presidency looks like it's going to be hard, so why not try buying it, right? And I think that actually was a reasonably attractive argument to a lot of people. Look, the effect that I think he had, unquestionably, for much of the last few months was to freeze the race nationally outside of the early states and for the candidates who were not already universally well known. If you were a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar, you were counting on being able to come out on top, or at least way on top of expectations, in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then have this sudden moment in the national spotlight where people in places where you haven't been able to campaign and where you've not been able to run ads see you on TV looking like a winner and saying, you know what, maybe I'll give this young mayor a chance. And there were a number of reasons why that didn't happen for them, not least of all that the state of Iowa completely blew the one thing that they say they're incredibly good at. But beyond that, no matter how much attention they got out of Iowa and New Hampshire, they were not getting as much attention as Mike Bloomberg was buying for himself in all of these Super Tuesday states, right? So I think it smothered their momentum. And then I also think on top of that, the fact that that whole week of the Nevada caucuses was about Mike Bloomberg's debate made it really tough for anybody else to meaningfully change the race in a big way. Yeah. So if you imagine that debate and the debate after it without Mike Bloomberg, do you think Joe Biden gets away with essentially taking no hits for 2 weeks? Probably not, right? Do people challenge Bernie Sanders a little bit more in the run-up to the Nevada caucuses if there's not this guy who's worth $60 billion on stage with you? I think probably not. So I don't know that we can say that if you subtract Mike Bloomberg from this race and rerun the last month, the outcome is going to be different, but we certainly would have gotten there by a different path.
I think that's really true. The Biden anxiety moment flowed to Bloomberg, and in South Carolina flowed to Steyer in a way that stopped the Buttigieg, Warren, Klobuchar folks from being able to make those inroads. And so when you get to South Carolina, the other candidates have not had the ability to grow their numbers, particularly on where the moderate base shifts, right? So from Iowa and New Hampshire, moderates look a lot differently than they do from South Carolina to the Super Tuesday states. And the kind of billionaires in the race had occupied those folks' attention. So once they were cut down, it was going back to the person who had the name recognition. And I think that just really, really hurt the candidates who were looking to jump up.
I want to switch gears to a candidate who is still in the race, Bernie Sanders. Lisa, you talked a little bit about looking at his numbers yesterday and what that might tell us about a ceiling. Alex, you've written a lot about his early political education and his sort of theory of the case that he's going to mobilize people. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, where it comes from, how he thinks about it, and what sort of information we have about whether that's going to work this time.
I'm sorry, I think I heard that question, but I'm just a little worried that one of us just exchanged the coronavirus.
I don't have it.
We had talked about not mentioning it.
Don't have it.
I
just have children, not coronavirus.
Everything's fine. Yeah.
Look, I think that so much of what you hear from Bernie Sanders in talking about his theory of how to win this election comes from his early experiences in, thank you, Vermont politics. And this whole idea that when you campaign as a revolutionary outsider, you drive participation by people who wouldn't normally show up, and it lets you win elections. That's exactly what he did in Burlington over and over, and it's ultimately what he did that got him to the House of Representatives. What we're seeing now is that running up against the reality that, like, turnout in a municipal election in Burlington is considerably lower under ordinary circumstances without a revolutionary candidate. Turnout in a municipal election is far lower than turnout in a presidential primary where there's not a revolutionary candidate on the ballot. So you would need to draw out so many more new voters of a particular disposition and demographic in order just to catch up with the neutral state of turnout in a presidential primary, let alone keep pace with the kind of surging turnout that we've seen. I also think that one thing that he learned in Vermont is that if you lose an election the first time, just keep running, and gradually you will grind people down and win. And no, I say that I say that genuinely. I think it's actually a testament to his real political strength and endurance, that this is a guy who, the first time he ran for office, he was seen as a joke, and he got basically no support. And he was running for US Senate in Vermont as a guy who had moved there by way of Brooklyn and Chicago like 15 minutes earlier, right? And he ran for Senate a number of other times and for a number of other offices, and guess what? 35 years later, he was a US Senator. And we can kind of laugh about how long it took him to get there, but like, you try moving to a state where you've not lived before and becoming a US Senator over any time period running as a socialist, right? So I do think that he thought this time, and there were signs for much of this race, and there still are signs that he's making inroads with people who were more skeptical of him previously. The problem is you can only run for president so many times when you start in your 70s.
Although we are seeing it's the
There's a lot of
quite
that
a few
this
times.
cycle.
Yeah, like you actually. So we've talked about Biden and Sanders, and obviously Warren is in the race still, but a lot of our headlines today, a lot of people have been calling it effectively a two-man race. And Lisa, I wanted to talk to you because it's not just there are two people left, it's that there are two men left, there are two 70-something white men left in a year that started with a historic number of women running, a historic number of people of color. I know you've been talking to voters, women and men, all year about the E word, the electability word. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what people meant when they said it a year ago, what they mean now, and what your sense is of how people are thinking about that we've landed on this field with the, reflecting on the Women's March, Me Too, the 2018 midterm results, and now here we are with our septuagenarian gentleman.
Well, so it's a fascinating conclusion of Democratic, I don't know if it's a conclusion, it's a fascinating point of Democratic politics in the Trump era, right? Because for most of the Trump era, Democrats have really celebrated the diversity of their bench and their field. They elected this historic number of women and people of color in 2018 to Congress. There were all these firsts that we heard about many, many times. But somehow that desire for representation stopped really at the presidency in the end, right? They ended up with this field, as you put it, to 70-something white guys. And I think part of this is just people feel really scared. They see voting for a woman as too much of a risk. It's unclear if that's true, right? Because people who have supported the female candidates, particularly elected female officials, say a female presidential candidate would be kind of like Trump's kryptonite. Look how he can't deal with Nancy Pelosi, be really strong. But that's just not where the voters are. They see it as very risky, and there's a lot of data bearing out that voters tend to view female candidates this way in sort of executive positions. But I think there's another thing going on too, which is that we're also coming out of this era of Me Too, where there's been this greater awareness of sexism and harassment and all these sort of gender biases. And I think some of these voters recognize that in their own life. Like you talk to them and say, oh, well, I thought more about this thing that happened at work or that thing. But then they take that and they don't perhaps draw the conclusion that the activists would like them to draw, right? They say, well, yes, I think sexism is really real, and that's why I can't vote for a woman, because they won't win because sexism is really real. And all these people in the country that I've never met, I would vote for a woman, but all these other people in the country that I've never met will not vote for a woman. So it's this kind of strange situation. But look, there were, 6 women on the stage, on the debate stage. That's never happened before, and that's a new thing. And so I think voters were exposed to a lot of different styles of running for president while being a woman. Before this, it was only Hillary Clinton, and she was sort of the one and only model. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops in the party. It's hard to ever imagine a presidential debate stage without any women, which of course was a fairly common thing. So that is a mark of progress, but I think a lot of women in the Democratic Party, particularly elected officials, didn't get to where they wanted to go. And I think there's a very high probability that there could be a female vice president on the ticket.
Speaking of women in the Democratic Party, Astead, what's your sense of both what Senator Warren thinks about this moment in terms of how women have fared in the race and what her supporters, the people who are at her events, are feeling?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to draw. I mean, the campaign has, since the first day until today, been very conscious of how they wanted to present themselves. This is a candidate who very rarely talked about identity at all, her own identity for the first 6 months of the race. And when you would get questions about it, would kind of intentionally go around it. Oh, I am here about my plans. I'm here about the issues, and that's what I want to talk about. We saw a kind of shift in the last 3-4 months. She now starts events. Last night, she started her event in Detroit saying, my name's Elizabeth Warren, and I'm the woman who's going to beat Donald Trump. It is a kind of recognition of where that electability question has moved in the primary. And you saw this from other candidates. Previously, I covered Senator Kamala Harris, and she would also go directly at the electability question towards the end. There was a sense that that it was weighing down the candidacy, and to climb out of that hole, you needed to just tell voters directly, don't be scared, vote for your heart. The problem is that sometimes those moments have come by the time the hole is too deep. The supporters, on the other hand, kind of universal in the idea that this was the candidate who had run the clearest message, had the most prepared kind of campaign, and was dragged down by a kind of sexist understanding of electability, a sexist media, and kind of just males who took up too much space in the race. And you hear that much more from the people attending the Warren events than Senator Warren herself. I think that might change. I mean, I think that we know that she's been talking more about it, as I said, but I think as the results have come and really kind of eroded her path to the nomination, there will be some rethinking, or not rethinking, but I think there will be a real look at the electability question and saying, if it swallowed up all the people of color, all the women, is that the kind of Democratic Party they want to have going forward?
I think all that is dead on, and the only other thing that I would add to that is if you look at both the response to her debate confrontation with Mike Bloomberg and the fact that it took that long for her to handle herself that way on a debate stage, it says a lot both about what a lot of Democrats, and I think particularly Democratic women, admire about her, and also the way she and the people who advise her see the limits of how much you can handle yourself that way, right? That was the most dominant debate performance I've ever seen as a reporter. And when you line that up against the debate in October in Ohio, where she just would not give a straight answer on how you're going to pay for Medicare for all, it's like you're dealing with two completely different candidates. And I think the view from people who, there's the view that says, why wasn't she like that all along? And there's, I think, a pretty compelling view that says if she was like that all along, people would have stopped liking her pretty fast, because you can only do that so much.
Right, and
also
also
the risk with that is the second debate where she was with Mike Bloomberg. She was. I agree with Alex completely about her the first time that she interacted with him. Yeah. The second time, when Bloomberg was a little better prepared, Warren got a more negative response, and we can debate why that was and what the debate hall crowd was like and who comprised it and how that came to be. But
what are you implying about the people that the Bloomberg campaign got into that?
I think there was some very overt cheering for Bloomberg maybe in that debate that might not have happened on its own. But I think that but I do think that to Alex's point about the limits of what women candidates are permitted to get away with, it is or be seen as getting away with. She was incredibly dominant, and then she actually continued similar arguments, and it was seen as taking it too far. I kept getting texts from people saying she's shrill, all of the words you normally hear about women. So
I think that
and there was the whole confrontation with Bernie Sanders over sexism, right? Which was sort of like a new third rail almost in politics, right? Like you're not, like when you talk to female candidates, they say they're in a bind on this, right? If you don't call out something that's sexism, then, it continues. But if you do call it out, then you're like pleading the victim. And that's kind of, this was a slightly different situation because she was accusing him of lying and he didn't give an inch, which is sort of Bernie Sanders' way generally. But I think that conflict, which was something that her campaign clearly thought would rebound to their advantage, I don't think it did.
I think the other moment when we talk about this issue in this race is a lot of other campaigns took the message from Senator Kamala Harris's debate against Joe Biden that attack did not work. And that was a reason, that was a proof point that candidates, both against attacking Joe Biden on the debate stage and then particularly women attacking him on the debate stage. I think that there's a lot of debate. I think that there is, the polling would tell us she did see a bump. She definitely saw a fundraising bump. I remember that night in Miami, there was this kind of universal feeling that the candidate that had so much promise had finally unlocked it. But what happened after certainly caused not just the Warren campaigns, but other campaigns to think, oh, maybe there is not an upside to not just attacking Biden on the stage, but when women go on the offensive in the debate moments.
So I did want to ask, what struck me is a lot of the way Warren spoke about gender for some time was just in pronouns. She would sneak in, a president can do something all by herself, and you said last night she started, I'm the woman who's going to beat President Trump. So Maggie, I did want to turn to you and thinking about the president and how he's assessing this field. He wished little Mike farewell this morning. Mini Mike, I'm sorry. Of course he used alliteration. Sorry to the president for stepping on his joke. I wondered if you could tell us, how engaged is he? What is your sense from his campaign team, if they do have a preference or their assessment of the field, or what is the view from the Trump campaign?
So a couple things. In terms of his level of engagement, the president, I think it was at the end of a coronavirus briefing, asked the reporters any questions for me about the election. So that should tell you where his head is. There is a gap between how the president views these things and how his more seasoned political advisors view these things. So the president was consumed by Bloomberg. He was captivated by how much money Bloomberg was spending. The things that Trump, sort of the language he speaks, are money, television airtime, and crowds. And so that means Bloomberg and Sanders. And those are two people he's been really focused on. He has been saying for months that he believes that he will treat Biden as some form of Hillary Clinton. he clearly caused some damage in terms of the Hunter Biden focus, but he also caused some damage to himself and got himself impeached over it. I don't, so, you know, it's kind of a, 6 of one, half dozen the other. But I mean, in all seriousness, the Biden resurgence was, I think, very startling to the president, because the president has this belief that he has this superpower where he can focus on people and he can impact outcomes. And he thought, you know, he would talk about this privately, that he thought, you know, he was really surprised that Warren came back when she had her surge back in the fall, after she had had a difficult year and after he had attacked her over talking about Native American roots. And so I think he was very surprised to see Biden come back the way he did. And I think that his response is going to be to go as nuclear at Biden as possible. And you are going to, you already saw that starting today. I think last night shows that there are limits to that. And so how much deeper that can go, how much more negative that can go, I think it remains to be seen.
So I have one more question from me, and then I will take some of your questions when they are offered to me. But you mentioned Trump's language is money, and we had, you know, some billionaires in the race. I was looking at the number that Tom Steyer spent, and the Wall Street Journal reported it as, thank you, more than $250 million of his own money, enough to buy 6,200 Teslas, which I think is the most relatable metric anyone could think of.
Right.
Is a billionaire going to run for president again? Like, what does this tell self-funders, the Steyer and Bloomberg?
I think as long as there are billionaires, they will run for president. That is kind of very billionaire-esque thing to do.
You know, I was in Selma over the weekend for the Bloody Sunday anniversary, and it was a mass amount of people. It was like 60, 70,000 people. And you could just see you know, Bloomberg was there with like 7 bodyguards around him. And it was one of those things that was a reminder that no matter how much you can put yourself in front of folks, that there is a element of presidential campaigning that is retail, and is just being a kind of person that wants to at least appear amongst the people.
Did he high-five any children?
He didn't. I didn't see him interact with any humans. And so, I mean, and then meanwhile, you had Steyer, who was like running a selfie line on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? And so, like,
what a somber commemoration.
Yeah, right. And so I just think that, particularly with the way we do states, small states building up, it does force a real importance on that. But will they run? Absolutely.
I think that Bloomberg was also a really good test case for whether a billionaire could succeed if they were actually quite qualified for the job, right? That, you know, Trump is obviously a very wealthy man, but it was, I think, Maggie, tell me if you disagree, but I think less just the fact of his wealth than how he had created this brand and was a celebrity associated with the idea of wealth, right? Mike Bloomberg obviously associated with great wealth, but he's not just some rich guy, right? And that was part of the case that his people made from the start. And I think it's part of what really resonated with voters from the start, that people know what it means to be mayor of New York, right? And he was able to run these ads where it wasn't just, you know, I'm Tom Steyer in this sort of suspiciously casual shirt talking to you about issues, right? It's, you know.
Wait till you see me in the tie.
Here I am at Ground Zero, right? And here I am with President Obama, and here I am, you know, fighting tobacco companies and gun manufacturers, and he has a record that people can really look to. And the fact that all of that didn't add up to more than it did, I think is a really cautionary tale for anybody whose candidacy in the future would be grounded on the idea that money would be their overwhelming advantage.
I think it's a really good point, and I also just think that combining things that Astead and Alex both said, that, you know, both Trump and Bloomberg actually campaigned in very similar ways in the sense of very limited retail, right? I mean, I can count on 2 hands the number of times Donald Trump actually went to a diner or did anything that wasn't a rally. But the rallies made his voters and his Twitter feed, as much as we all might not want to have to be as tethered to his Twitter feed as we are, his Twitter feed and the rallies made a lot of his voters feel like they had some connection to him. And Bloomberg just had nothing that could serve as that proxy.
And you know who else does that? the Trump model is, of course, Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
He does
Which is-
not do a ton of retail.
Right.
He does the rallies.
Right.
He's active on social media, and people feel like they are part of a movement. You know,
So on that point, I do want to transition to a couple of questions from the audience, and this is related to Sanders and the zeal people feel for him. The question is, if Biden wins, do you have any sense if Bernie voters will show up and vote for Biden in the general? Lisa, what do you think?
that is the question, right? That is the question.
Yes,
I think a lot of it will. What? Well, it's also the big overarching question, I think. I mean, I think I'm sort of out of the prediction business, particularly after last time. But I think like some of it will depend on how that period, if Biden becomes the nominee and if he gets to 1991 pledged delegates that you need to get the nomination, some of it will depend on how he handles that post period and what overtures are made to Sanders supporters and how this all sort of goes down. I think this is where the Bloomberg piece of it gets kind of interesting. I think a lot of Sanders supporters don't want to see Michael Bloomberg particularly involved in this race, particularly in the primary. So how Michael Bloomberg is used by the Biden campaign and how he's deployed will be interesting. So I don't think we can, and of course the size of the win. I think if Biden were to capture it, how big a margin he gets in those delegates will matter. So I don't think it's something we can really know right now, but we can certainly sort of read the tea leaves of how they manage the next couple months and see and get a feel for how people are feeling. I mean, there was definitely a very strong sense that if Bernie, so the rule is you have to reach 1991 pledged delegates, which is a majority, but the Sanders supporters felt very strongly that if he reached a plurality of the pledged delegates, he should get the nomination. A lot of the party disagreed with that. They thought it should go to a second ballot. That's all a little bit moot now because you have two candidates, right? So someone should reach 50% of the pledged delegates. So I think Democrats have largely avoided the specter of a contested convention, which have been a pretty big nightmare for the party. But the question will be how this all plays out between the two camps going forward.
Alex, what do you think?
If I'm Joe Biden, what makes me nervous is less the idea of sort of the Bernie or bust crowd, right? Which I think at the end of the day is, real but limited, and more just the fact that Biden has demonstrated such little appeal to young voters generally, right? So I think Lisa's absolutely right about the various ways that this could play out over the next couple months. But I think even if it plays out quite well for Biden over the last couple months, and he wins very convincingly, and Bernie Sanders concedes gracefully, none of which is necessarily going to happen. I'm still worried if I'm Joe Biden about how am I going to connect with these voters who just don't really see their aspirations and concerns reflected in me. And maybe you can do that with the right running mate, or maybe Joe Biden's going to need to learn how to do politics in a little bit of a different way after half a century in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, right, there's so many things that you can take from the 2016 loss from Democrats, but one of the things that I think is universally recognized is there just wasn't enough attention put by the Clinton campaign on motivating and the base, and to kind of smooth out the concerns that they had about the nomination. And I think that the question of will the Bernie crowd vote for them, I would flip to putting the onus on the Biden campaign. If he is the nominee, will the Biden campaign feel as if they must motivate this crowd and reach out to younger voters, reach out to the kind of first-time voters that Bernie brought in places like Nevada? And I think that will be an interesting kind of sign to where they think their kind of electability general election case is going.
What is a plausible youth-oriented celebrity endorsement that Biden could legitimately claim if to reach those young people? The youth. Who do the youth like who also could conceivably like Joe Biden?
I'm not going to answer this question.
And maybe we need to throw it to the
person
youth
on this panel.
Yeah.
Am I being the youth representative? I mean, Bernie Sanders, one, but right? The obvious person who can make this happen is if it really seems like the Democratic Party is coming together with the people who have led the ideological polls on both sides. If you're just talking celebrity, like, yikes.
That's good. We can leave it at yikes.
Yeah. I mean, I think Clinton showed the limits of those people.
Yeah.
True. That's true. Maggie, I'll direct this to you. The question is, President Trump seems almost invincible in every scandal. With such power, what does the Democratic candidate need to do to defeat him?
They need to turn out enough voters to win states. I mean, it's really that simple, right? I mean, I know that one of the things that has been really striking about the last 3 years, and we've talked about this in various ways, not on this stage, but certainly in our coverage and at other panels that we've done, is that Trump's stability in his numbers, right? I mean, they have generally been somewhere between the very high 30s on approval to low 40s. I think in Gallup, he recently hit 49, although and he liked to point to that was pretty clearly a lot of coalescing of Republicans as he was getting impeached. And I don't know that speaks for a general trend going forward. I will say that the president at the moment, we have 8 months to go. A lot is going to happen, and a day feels like a year, frankly, in terms of news cycles. But he is right now experiencing something that's incredibly difficult for him, which is that, I mentioned earlier that he likes to think he has this superpower. He likes to control events, and he likes to bend institutions and people to his will. And right now he's got a coronavirus that he can't control, and that his administration is under enormous criticism for its response to. The stock market only rebounded on the news of Joe Biden's wins last night, and he views the stock market as his pole. And then in general, he has the Democratic contest, which he's clearly not been an active player in, despite his best efforts. So we'll see. I mean, but I think at the end of the day, it's just Democrats have to make a compelling case that voters should go to the polls and vote for them. That's what this is going to be won on. And if Biden is the nominee, and I just want to keep stressing, I mean, to Lisa's point, we have a million different ways this is going to turn out, and we don't know what it will look like. There's many months to go. I don't know what it's going to look like if it's Joe Biden versus Bernie Sanders on a debate stage for an hour and a half. Just the two of them, right? This is not going to be, no, I'm being serious. This is not going to be a debate where Biden gets 10 minutes of talk time and everybody else is yelling at each other. There's going to be a lot of fits and starts before the convention.
A last one from the audience, and then we'll do a quick lightning round. So someone who is still running, who we haven't spoken about yet, and this is to Lisa. The question is, what the hell is Tulsi Gabbard doing?
I mean...
And sorry, Lisa has reported on Tulsi. It wasn't just throw her a challenge. Yeah.
She's living her best life, right? She's retired from the... she's not running for re-election. She's still campaigning. I think she was hopeful that she would get, I mean, there's different theories of the case. Some people say she likes attention. Some people say she has a message that she's pushing, of being against foreign intervention, but then other people point out that she met with Assad, so maybe that. So it's not, there's a lot of consternation and confusion in, I think, political circles about what she's doing. I think she was definitely hoping to get on the debate stage. She won a delegate from American Samoa. But then, and the DNC debate rules had been that if you get a delegate, you get a spot on the stage. But then after she won her delegate, we asked them, and they quickly said the rules were going to change to reflect the current state of the race, where one delegate was not going to cut it. You had to win, some higher metric of, maybe 5. I don't know. So that's not going to happen for her.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Do you see a world where she tries to run as an independent candidate or a third-party candidate in a handful of states?
That's the big fear, right, is that she'll do that. I mean, she has said up and down, over and over, that she would not do that. So
we'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see what happens,
We'll see what happens.
Right.
So I will do a quick lightning round here to cap off our evening, to sort of leave you with real insight, even more insight and knowledge that you've had so far. Maggie, you mentioned multiple times in a way that hit me hard that we still have 8 months to go, and that
I can say it again.
A week. What did you say? A second feels like an eternity. Yeah,
no,
that's
the way
I heard it. A day
feels like.
It has felt a little bit of a time warp. I'm sure all of you engaged news consumers and citizens feel that as well. So, someone asked me yesterday, when do you think impeachment happened? And it took me longer than I'm comfortable admitting to say the month. So I thought that would be fun to spring on you on stage right now.
When did it end or when did it start?
When did it occur? When was he impeached?
I was so close. I know when he was impeached.
Yeah, the month.
Yeah.
All I want is the month.
He was impeached, I believe, in January, because Pelosi held on to the articles of impeachment for a while. But I can't tell you the date. The date of the Senate vote where he was acquitted was February 5th.
And Iowa was February 3rd.
Right.
So maybe we can work.
All right,
but
so
it was
here-
January.
It was January.
It was January. It was before
It
Iowa.
was January. Here are a few specifics. I want to know when, this is a quote, I want to know when this happened. This is a quote from Beto O'Rourke. Though it is difficult to accept, it is clear to me now that this campaign does not have the means to move forward successfully. This was his Medium post, which was signed "With you always and forever grateful."
It was at the.
That was at the JJ dinner.
We were there.
We were in Iowa.
It was November.
No.
This is terrible.
We were there. We covered it.
It was November. We got it.
It was November.
It was November. It was November 1st.
Yeah.
It was before Thanksgiving.
I watched them take their signs and put
Yeah,
them in
it
the
was-
garbage.
Oh.
It was very sad.
It was.
Okay, here, this is a quote from Bernie Sanders. I want to just know the month. After 2.5 days in the hospital, I feel great, and after taking a short time off, I look, what?
November.
October.
October debate, yeah.
October. Got it.
Okay, this is from Troy Price, the now former chair of the Iowa Democratic Party. I want to say I am sorry. I am deeply sorry for the challenges we had on Monday evening.
Too soon after February 3rd than it should have been. I mean, too long after February 3rd than it should have been.
February, I don't know, Alex, you probably.
It did take too long. It wasn't the next day.
It was like the 8th, maybe, the 7th?
It was the 5th. That took him till the 5th.
Oh, that's.
To apologize.
That's
And then, so you got the impeachment date right. Do you remember what month the articles were delivered? I mean,
We're sent over?
Yes.
We're sent over.
We're sent over in January.
January.
No?
No, I'm wrong. When did Adam Schiff deliver the news, his judgment over the course of the last 3 months? We have found incontrovertible evidence that President Trump abused his power.
That was before they sent over the articles of impeachment. That was December.
It was December. It was December, but it feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago. So as we've discussed, Michael Bloomberg is no longer with us as a candidate, and one of the things that we as a politically engaged populace have lost are his jokes. Using a generous definition of what a joke is. But he did try and tell them in most public settings, and I don't want to say goodbye to them yet, and I think we should give some of his best lines a reading. And so I'm going to ask you, I have a couple here, and I'm just asking you to pick whichever one on this list you want to read, and deliver it the way it deserved to be delivered, which is possibly not the way Michael Bloomberg would have delivered it. So these are real jokes. These are real jokes.
It's a hard test.
Written for Michael Bloomberg to deliver, performed for you today by these political reporters. Pick your poison, Astead.
I'm glad I'm going first.
Oh, God.
Okay.
No. We have a bad draw here, Alex.
Now, I think I'm the only candidate to come to Wilmington, but all of them should visit. Senator Warren should go to Elizabeth Pizza on Market Street. Senator Klobuchar could go to Flaming Amy's restaurant. Senator Sanders could go to the KGB bar.
That's generous.
When my speechwriter came up with that one, I thought it was pretty good too.
I guess I don't get to read the same one again. It's really, I just keep hearing his voice in my head.
You can do an accent, yeah.
Now, I know I'm not the only Jewish candidate running for president, but I am the only one who doesn't want to turn America into a kibbutz.
I think that was the best reception that you've ever
Good.
I have to tell you, I find this really physically uncomfortable.
You're not the only one.
I really am surprised that all of these, my fellow contestants up here, I guess would be the right word for it, given nobody pays attention to the clock, I'm surprised they showed up, because I would have thought after I did such a good job in beating them last week that they'd be a little afraid to do that.
You recall that was the joke he inserted like an hour into the second debate. He had just remembered someone had written it for him. Yeah. I'm glad it got its second airing here. All right, Lisa.
Okay.
Bring us home.
You guys left me with a rough draw. I have decided that before I die, I'm going to speak Spanish like a native and hit a golf ball like a professional. And that just means I'm going to live a very long time.
So maybe we haven't seen the last of him as a presidential candidate. On our way out, I know we've talked about how unexpected things are in this particular race and politics in general. I wondered if there's a prediction, however large or small, you're comfortable making for between now and when the Democrats have their convention in July. Lisa.
I predict there will be at least 4 to 5 more waves of intense Democratic anxiety that we will cover.
Alex.
I predict there will be several weeks where we are all wildly uncertain about whether there will be conventions at all.
Oh, that's a good
one.
call. I'm out of the prediction business after 2016.
Fair.
I'm out of the prediction business after 2016.
Smart woman.
Fair.
I'm retiring after right now.
Wow. Well, I'm glad we caught you in under the wire. Well, I'm not going to give myself the same challenge because that's the host prerogative, but I can state, this is not a prediction, I can state with certainty that we're going to be doing this again a couple times in New York and perhaps on the road before November. And we'd love to have you join us again. It was a pleasure to have you all here tonight. Please join me, we'll clap at the end, in thanking our guests, Lisa Lerer, Alex Burns, Maggie Haberman, Astead Herndon. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.